Welcome to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. Hope you're having a great day as we continue to celebrate all the amazing people across the great state of Mississippi who are working so hard to make this such a great place to live, work, and play. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for listening on SuperTalk Mississippi Radio. I say SuperTalk Mississippi Media is the name of the company. It's a multimedia, digitally, diversified company, but radio is still king. That's the good news. So no matter where you're listening, you know that SuperTalk has established itself with this incredibly unique multimedia approach to what it's doing. And it's given those of us in positions like mine the opportunity to have a voice in the community in ways that can help bring change and educate people and introduce people to one another in ways that they may not have been able to get to know each other before. So thank you for listening. We really appreciate you being here. It's no surprise to you that I'm a bit of a weather geek, especially tropical weather geek. So I've enjoyed my conversations with a series of meteorologists and storm chasers, during my tenure here on this show. But one of the people I really enjoyed getting to know was Jeff Vorick. You may remember him. He was a meteorologist at WXXV, and he left WXXV to go work for a service in Houston, Texas. We'll let him tell you more about that here in just a second. But we've stayed in touch with each other because we share a love of watching the tropics and weather in general. And I said, you know what, we need to get Jeff back on the show. First of all, see what's been up in his life, but just so we can talk about weather. So without any further ado, let me welcome Jeff back to the show. How you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great, Ricky. Thanks for having me back on.
Where are you sitting right now?
I'm in an RV in Fort Myers, Florida on vacation right now. I was in Daytona 2 days ago, and then I'm flying up to Atlanta in about 2 days as well.
Well, that's neat, and we'll come back to Daytona. First of all, it was a good race. Weather was a challenge, but as you pointed out, you knew it was coming. Trump was there. The Thunderbirds were there. It's really an interesting, a lot of interesting reasons to be there. But you grew up down in the Keys, man, and so to be in Fort Myers, that you have to feel like you're at home.
Absolutely. Being a stone's throw away from Sanibel Island right now is nice. And while this area is still a little bit bruised and battered from the last 3 years of hurricane impacts, I mean, still always nice to come back and especially just enjoy my time in the sun while I have a week off from hard days of work.
Yeah, I have. I've had some conversations with people on the show. The former CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Council, Ashley Edwards, who himself, incidentally, is a weather geek, is involved in a company now, and they actually help cities like Fort Myers after disasters. They bring a very specific skill set in helping to work with them and the federal government to help the recovery effort. And he's kind of given me. He's been involved in Fort Myers since shortly after the hurricane. But it's amazing when you think about how hard that area was hit, especially the Barrier Islands. And to see where they are today, they're slowly but surely digging their way out of this. It's not going to be the incredibly long recovery that coastal Mississippi had, but in some respects, some of the impacts were just as great, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Ian brought about a 15 to 18 foot storm surge from about Bonita Springs, Florida, which is just south of Fort Myers, all the way to about Inglewood and Venice. And unfortunately, Fort Myers Beach being on a very delicate barrier island in a bay on a very shallow continental shelf, not unlike the Mississippi coast, they dealt with a great storm surge impact with Ian in 2022, not to mention the winds from a near Category 5 hurricane. Helene, even though being about 100 miles offshore, brought the second highest storm surge, and Milton also provided a second impact about a week and a half after that. So these folks have had a hard time down here, but you wouldn't guess it. Everybody here has been bright and cheery, but Gulf Coast cannot catch a break after the last about 5 years from 2020 on. It has been
it's pretty amazing when you think about it. Just from the point of view of coastal Mississippi, for the most part, I mean, you think about those repeated hits that you just mentioned. For the most part, coastal Mississippi has been incredibly lucky, haven't we?
Yep, and Laura in 2020 was a bad one for Western Louisiana, Southwest Louisiana, rather. And you've had several storms that have just targeted Louisiana, the Gulf Coast of Florida, but thankfully the Mississippi coast has avoided great impacts. You still have had some decent hits with Nate in 2017, Zeta in 2020, and it does not take much of onshore flow to cause a great storm surge along Highway 90, and it shows time and time again, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's for sure. And we'll talk more. In fact, I want to look back on last year's season and what they thought would happen, what ultimately did happen, what kind of conversations are happening already about this season. I want to talk about all that. But hey, let's go back to Daytona 500. Have you been before?
Yeah, it was my 10th time going. I've gone with my family members in Florida. I've gone with some friends I've met over the years as well. It's always fun to go back. I go to the Daytona 500 pretty often, but I try to make it to the August race too. It's a fun place to go see a race, and it's one of the nicest motorsports facilities in the world, and arguably one of the nicest sporting venues in the United States.
It's interesting. NASCAR has had a moment. I mean, think about it. It was a car racing dynasty that was dominated by the big names. I think about Dale Earnhardt and Kevin Harvick and Gordon and those people. It's been slowly but surely kind of building back again and creating new young personalities. And so when you look at it based on where it is today and where it might have been, let's say 10 years ago, where is NASCAR today?
NASCAR right now is a little bit behind from its heyday. You had so many factors go into why it had a downfall. The passing of Dale Earnhardt 24 years ago today, that was hard on the fan base. The 2008 financial crisis really made it hard for a lot of blue collar folks to be able to travel to these races now. And with how the hotel market behaves every weekend, it's so difficult to get to these races. In the 2010s, you had less than stellar racing in some aspects. You had a schedule that did not change for about 19 years, where it was revolving around cookie cutter intermediate tracks. You took away some of the historic fan base, really the hotbeds of the fan base tracks like North Wilkesboro, Rockingham, and you start taking races away from other venues. That led to a downfall. 2010s, you also had drivers retiring, big names, Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, Dale Earnhardt Jr., amongst others. And there wasn't a lot of promotion for the younger new drivers coming up. Of course, Chase Elliott, beloved driver across the fan base. Kyle Larson's gotten more popular again with just how well he's done in Hendrick Motorsports. Now you're finally starting to get sponsorship activation and people really beginning to hone in on their favorite drivers, their favorite people. NASCAR's returning to more of its roots in its fan base. North Wilkesboro's back. Bowman Gray Stadium makes a return. And Atlanta Motor Speedway is back on the date 2 times. And along with enhancing the fan experience at the racetrack, Daytona now is much more of a party-like atmosphere than it used to be in front of the stands. A lot of sponsorship activation. And my personal favorite driver, actually, from where I'm staying now, is Ross Chastain. And Busch and Busch Light are really making a push in their marketing department to make sure he's their guy. And slowly but surely, it's coming back. The new TV deal, you have streaming now involved. Slowly but surely, NASCAR is evolving and trying to reach more households as well. So it's improving. I don't think we'll ever get back to where we were in the 2000s when the sport was just all-time high, but slowly beginning to recover a fan base and finally starting to see more positive momentum.
Well, that's, by the way, a great answer from a guy who obviously follows the sport really closely. I have a friend of mine who's still a huge NASCAR fan. I enjoy watching the races. I don't follow it as closely, but what I do know is this: that the thing that you're referring to, where they get back to the heyday, they actually might, and the reason why they might. And I'll hold that for a second. I'll tell you the reason why they might in just a second. But one thing is for sure, they are an industry that is defined by personalities. That's why these big names that you mentioned that have retired, or in case of Dale Earnhardt, unfortunately died. The reality is it's very much about the personality. So if you look at, and I'm sure you watch this, but the series about Formula One on Netflix, what that did to put those guys' names in the minds of Americans who would have never paid attention to Formula One. And being able to see what's going on behind the scenes and what it takes to run a team and the high stakes and the money that's involved in it and all of that. NASCAR has all those possibilities now, with not just reality shows that will continue to, I think, mount from NASCAR, but also the role social media plays in that, and how the personality side of that will continue to emanate as a big part of it. They may actually make their way back there. I mean, some of their new stars, you mentioned Chase Elliott, but I watched an interview with him before the race, and gosh, man, he was extremely articulate and a good-looking dude that really understood, the dynamics of his team. And you have a lot of rising stars like that speak well and that people are drawn to. I think that's going to be really good for NASCAR as we go forward. Hey, we're having the opportunity. We're actually going to talk about weather here in just a second with my friend Jeff Vorick, who's a meteorologist. Used to be with XXVs in Houston. When we come back on the other side, we'll talk a little bit about what's he doing these days, and then we'll talk about some of the weather situations that we faced recently. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank Studio. We're visiting with my friend Jeff Vorick, who was a meteorologist at WXXV. He's living in Houston now. He's actually on vacation right now, and the vacation involved going to Daytona, the Daytona 500. He's actually in Fort Myers as we speak. Hey, before we move away from Daytona real quick, I just want to mention, what was it like to see the flyover of Air Force One?
Oh, it was just amazing. I mean, they entered an approach. They went just north and west of the track and flew right over to the low pass on the runway, flew back around again, then came in and landed. It was impressive. I mean, anytime a sitting president comes and attends a sporting event you're at, it's something special. The Thunderbirds afterward were incredible too. They did about 3 different encores in addition to the flyover during the national anthem. It was just awesome. It felt like an event again, and that's the best thing.
Yeah, that's cool to see. I was a little concerned the way he got out of his highly protected limousine with his granddaughter and stood there with all those people. It's scary to see a president that some would hope wouldn't live through today, being in our population, sadly. But I'm sure that the security getting into that place was pretty high.
Yeah, I sat in line for about an hour and a half, made a couple friends while I was at it, of course. And I mean, Secret Service was there. TSA was actually the one checking us at the gate, and they had snipers on top of the stadium and everywhere. And I mean, everybody had to get searched in the infield as well. It was safe. I mean, everybody felt safe, and you certainly weren't going to be getting out of there and coming back in very easily. That's the only downfall, but whatever's necessary is just what you have to do.
Yeah, that was cool. It's cool to be able to talk to you about something that we all observed on TV. So tell us more about what you're doing these days.
Yeah, I had to leave WXXV. I just needed a career move for those reasons, and there was an ad for a job that popped up in Houston, Texas, at a private aviation trip support company. We deal with corporate jets and private jets for quite a few people of the upper class, to say the least. And I saw that opening, interviewed for it, and I took the job. And Houston's cost of living is not too high, and the money was certainly better. So it was a necessary move I had to make. With some fortunate circumstances, I was actually able to start taking the lead on my shift. And outside of course, the normal aviation operations, we're forecasting takeoff, en route, and arrival for these pilots. You're also giving the passengers information, whether they're going over to Europe, they need specific information for their ski trip to Switzerland or even Vail in Colorado, or they just want to know what the beach weather's like, or they want to go kayaking, fishing, whatnot. Give them what they need. And the coolest thing I got to do, which thankfully I didn't have to break too far away from my love of tropical, with the unfortunate impact of so many storms in the United States, we had to brief a lot of clients that are based in the Gulf Coast, especially in the Houston area, New Orleans area, and all across Florida, all the way through the Carolinas, just to let them know, hey, here's what's coming, and give them a special forecast ahead of time. It's a cool, dynamic workplace. I work with some of the most funny and awesome people I've ever met too. It's different, but I definitely enjoy it. I do miss the coast every day, though. Nothing beats the people on the Mississippi coast, in my opinion.
Well, you've done a great job of staying in touch with people like me. It's interesting how you develop relationships, and no matter where people go, you keep that connection, and you've done a good job with me. Houston, incidentally, my son Justin, when he first started to work for Price Waterhouse, he lived in Houston for a period of time, working in the energy sector. He lives in New York City now, but my wife has family that live in the Woodlands area, and they like it, and they've been there for many, many years. So Houston's not a bad place. It's a big city, and you got the crunch of traffic and all that goes with a big city, but it's a cool place.
Absolutely. It's a lot of fun living there. I mean, everybody and their sister comes to visit in terms of concerts, and then good sports scene. I definitely do enjoy it. And wanted to something new, and I definitely have loved every bit of it there.
It's interesting. I've watched your industry closely, and if there was a position at TV stations that I would think would be solid, and I'll suggest to you going forward, it will still be solid because of a very specific reason. I'll come back to that in a second. But is the meteorologist, because you're talking about the ultimate local impact, weather, and the ability to communicate weather to local folks. I've been watching this Allen Media Group effort do away with their meteorologists at their many TV stations, and of course, it's been a super controversial move. They've got a lot of backlash from it. But Allen Media also owns the Weather Channel, and so they're using their purchase of the Weather Channel as a way to sort of maybe regionalize or maybe nationalize what would be usually a local meteorologist point of view. And they're doing it because they're trying to create some economy of scale from owning the Weather Channel. Other TV stations, unless they own the Weather Channel or something like it, would have a hard time doing this because the pushback would be so enormous. It was bad enough what Allen Media Group did just in general. How do you view what happened, and what are people in your industry saying about it?
I believe Allen Media did go back on that decision, but who knows for how long, right? And it's certainly tragic to see. I mean, there are a lot of us, including me. My first passion was wanting to do broadcast. I watched David Bernard over the years, Brian Norcross in South Florida, and I was like, I want to be like these guys. I want to do this. But it's changing with the times. Local TV's dying. I mean, you don't get the same ratings for your 10 o'clock news that you used to. It's an unfortunate side effect of how media consumption is changing. But I mean, props to a lot of local agencies, and this is nonprofits, police and fire, and municipalities, counties. They have gotten incredibly good with getting press releases out before the 5 o'clock news comes on. I got to give a lot of credit to those folks. And social media has taken over too. People just don't tune in for the 5 o'clock or 10 o'clock news anymore. But the one thing you can't replace is your local meteorologist, because no disrespect to the fine folks that work at, say, Fox Weather or the Weather Channel in Atlanta, but they're not going to know the local intersections, the local restaurants, the local landmarks like your local TV meteorologist is going to know. There was a saying from James Spann at ABC 3340 in Birmingham. He mentioned nobody's going to know a thing or care a thing about 12 miles southwest of a certain town. But like, if you say it's going over this highway intersection by this famous restaurant, people will sure as heck take action. And you need to keep the local meteorologists around. They're going to know your community. They're going to know how to forecast based on your local climate, your local tendencies. And it's only a matter of time, though, because before things start getting phased out, you have to start trimming budget and saving money for some of these places. And local meteorologists need to be the ones that remain in place, because ultimately you want that trusted local voice guiding you through the storm, whether that's a severe thunderstorm in winter, spring in coastal Mississippi, or the next hurricane, heaven forbid, that comes to the area.
Yes, you mentioned Norcross, Bernard, and Spann. For weather enthusiasts, all those names and many more are like them. Norcross having made his name during Hurricane Andrew, working down in South Florida. I'm sure that as a guy growing up, you had to look towards someone like Norcross and say, I want to be like him.
Absolutely. I mean, they do it so well. They keep the science involved, but they make sure that for the average viewer, it can be digested in those bite-sized chunks. And when they do it well and they actually care about what they do, it definitely leaves a mark on you.
And see, James Spann, because I was born in Birmingham and had responsibilities for companies in Birmingham and have family that still live in Birmingham. But I followed James Spann down here. I still probably follow him even if I didn't have those connections back to Birmingham, because he does such a good job. What he's done is he's done a good job of translating from TV into social media in a way that can touch a lot of people way beyond what would be normally the viewing area for him in the Birmingham area. I would say most of the really, really good TV guys have done that, and it's almost like they have a dual life. They have their TV responsibilities, but then they have this massive national audience that pays attention to them, especially on things like Tropical. But, you can have your cake and eat it too. You just have to be smart about it, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. You just have to show you care and make sure you put the correct information out, do it all in the right way. Don't scare people, make them want to come to you for reliable, timely information. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of good, responsible voices in there, and I'm thankful we do have a lot of good ones. And I mean, Span does a lot serving beyond just the Birmingham, Tuscaloosa areas. He takes care of everybody in Alabama, and I mean, heck, it's good to see him caring about Mississippi just across the line too.
It is really cool. Hey, one of the interesting things, speaking of sort of the national footprint for weather channels, you've seen some movement there, but obviously the Weather Channel has been sort of the big one at the table. But what Fox Weather has done in a really short period of time, Jeff, has been something to observe, especially most recently with those most recent hurricanes that you and I have been talking about that have hit Florida and gone beyond there. But their coverage, they're on par, if not better than Weather Channel in some respects. And they're an alternative to the Weather Channel. They came into this wanting to win this battle, didn't they?
They came in and they made it really accessible too, because anytime you go on, say, Tubi TV, your Roku TV at home, or heck, any streaming device, they're free and available at any time. And they're even over the air in some markets, including for me in Houston. They've taken over. They took a lot of really good talent that was previously on the Weather Channel or even in some areas in South Florida. And I mean, Brian Norcross is on there now. Mike Seidel is their lead guy in live. And then they have a lot of excellent young folks that do really well there too. And they've really, they've really come into their own. And I mean, I was just watching them to observe, and I was really impressed how they were
Let's
covering.
do this. We'll pick it up right there. When we get on the other side, we'll continue our conversation with Jeff Vorick when we get back. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio. We're visiting with my friend Jeff Vorick, who used to be with WXXV, works for a private service in Houston now, I would say, providing weather information to a bunch of rich people. That's the way I would describe what he does now. But he grew up. He was born and raised in the Florida Keys. We try to get to Key West about every 3 or 4 years at least. We love the Keys, and in fact, the next big family vacation in the next year or so is going to be back down to the Keys. It's just a special place. We love the feeling of it. It's just something to behold. Okay, so we were talking about Fox weather and the Weather Channel, and we'll close that thought out. But I think one of the things that they've done is begun to build those relationships between the meteorologists and the people who are viewing. And I think, it was so dumb of the Weather Channel to lay Mike Seidel off, because he immediately comes in, and during the crunch moments of hurricanes, especially, or certainly big weather events, Mike Seidel was kind of the face on the ground of the Weather Channel. Now he's the face on the ground for Fox Weather, and people are familiar with him. Brian Norcross, bringing him into the fold the way they did. He says a very unique approach to doing it. And by we feel familiar because of those guys, and then the people that they're leaders on their meteorological desk. We're getting to know them better now, and we're starting to have a relationship with them, and that's not good for the Weather Channel at the end of the day. Then if people haven't watched lately, you probably ought to go click between the two. That's what we do. I watch both of them, and I've watched a significant stepping up in the quality of Fox weather over the past year or so, and it's been terrific to watch. And I think that they're very relevant to the conversation these days, aren't they, Jeff?
Absolutely. I mean, they came in and they showed up during Helene and Milton, just with excellent coverage. It did help that I believe Steve Bender, even Ian Oliver, rather, they're locals to the Tampa area and grew up in Florida, so they brought a wealth of knowledge in there too. But I mean, they continued the coverage with Helene's aftermath in the Carolinas, and they brought it to the table with Milton. They did better than their Helene coverage of that one. They do a remarkable job, and they're bringing the right folks in, but also they got a good young core that they've built in as well.
Well, you know what's interesting? You can tell that Fox brings a news competency to the table. Because in the aftermath of Helene, you brought attention to that, and I think that's one of the reasons they're so successful. Their on the ground coverage there for weeks afterwards, covering every angle, was way beyond what you would normally see from a weather channel. From a weather channel, it was covering it from every. It was giving voice to people who didn't have the opportunity to be heard, and it was spectacular what they did.
Absolutely. And I mean, poor folks in North Carolina, Tennessee and the upstate of South Carolina, they got brutal impacts, that once in a generation type impacts, if not even fewer and far between. And Fox Weather they were showing everything, all the relief efforts, what's being rebuilt, how long is it going to take. And it was great to see them stick around even after just the thrilling coverage during the event as well.
Yeah, just really special stuff. So let's go back to last year's hurricane season for a second. At the beginning, we get all these reports of what we should expect, and then we experience the season. And one of the points I always like to make is it's almost like all these predictions aren't necessary. They are in a way that they help people prepare, but if you're in North Carolina, all it takes is one. And that's the thing you always have to remember. But it was a really busy season, wasn't it?
It for sure was. And I mean, these seasonal forecasts, they're incredibly smart people that make these forecasts. And whether this is outside of hurricanes, we're talking about seasonal forecasts for winter, for what's coming spring, summer, and fall. Incredibly smart people. They do very well. They have evidence to back it up. With hurricane season, you're looking at the ENSO state, so El Nino or La Nina, and the background state of the ocean. If you have temperatures well above average and you're transitioning from a warm ENSO state to what last year was expected to be cold neutral or going into La Nina, combine that with incredibly warm Atlantic and Gulf waters, and it is a recipe for a busy season. But some factors came in there, and dare I say, the water was actually too warm in some spots, and things kind of didn't materialize the way they thought they would. But all that matters at the end of it are impacts. And the season was incredibly backloaded, and it was on par with 2017 and 2005 for the damage numbers. And unfortunately, too many lives were lost. And at the end of the day, that's all that matters.
What's interesting, I had Frank Bordeaux, who's an insurance executive and expert here in coastal Mississippi and really the state of Mississippi. And he's someone I really rely on to teach me about the reinsurance markets and how Mississippi fits into the sort of global picture. And one of the things that we're seeing is that insurance companies are no longer just looking for coastal areas to do fortified rebuilding, but now you see these big wind events going way up, in this case, the Appalachians. You're going to see, like, the 6 coast counties of coastal Mississippi did a pretty good job of getting stronger building codes and all the things we need to do to get better insurance rates, et cetera. But you get north of there, and they don't have the same kind of building codes in place. And what's happening now, hurricane or insurance companies are beginning to look at that and say, wait a minute, this is not just a coastal event. We're going to start to require everyone that's anywhere near a coast to have much stronger building codes. And there was not going to be. I think that's going to make us a lot more resilient. But man, last season taught us a lot about when you think you've seen it all, you haven't yet.
Definitely. And before I touch on the swarm of systems that hit the United States, one honorable mention is Alberto, formed from the Central American gyre, very typical formation, hits in in Tampico or Veracruz province or state of Mexico rather. And you still had 4 feet of storm surge in a lot of the coastal areas in Texas. And that would be Freeport and Surfside Beach in Texas near the Galveston area. And Galveston got 4 feet as well. This was before you had Beryl. Beryl was a Cabo Verde wave that developed about 2 months ahead of schedule, strengthened east of the Lesser Antilles, made a hard hit on the windwards, peaked at Category 5 strength earlier than any other system had ever done. Not to mention, first June Category 4 on record, if I'm not mistaken. Jamaica gets brushed with it. Cancun gets a rough impact. And here comes this disheveled storm off of the Yucatan Peninsula, tracks directly towards Texas. And a lot of us at my company saw this thing making a beeline towards the upper portion of Matagorda Bay, and just west and southwest of Houston. This thing turned it on about 12 hours before landfall. And unfortunately, yet a strong Category 1 making landfall due south of Houston, Texas, tracks along the western edge of the metro. And guess what? America's fourth largest city is plunged into darkness and is off the grid for the better part of a week in July, mind you.
Yeah, is that incredible? Of course, I was in touch with you during that whole time, but what an amazing turn of events. If it had another 12 hours over the water, this thing was getting organized fast. And I mean, the impacts were severe enough, but the impacts could have been even greater. I mean, it would have been a massive story beyond the story it already was.
Definitely. And as the season progressed, though, these waves kept coming off of Africa. The African easterly jet, I need to look deeper into the research that has been published about it. The easterly jet, which is one of the mechanisms that spawns these waves along a monsoon trough, it was tracking much farther north than usual. And this was going across the Sahel region of Africa and southern portions of the Sahara Desert. These waves were also much larger because they were closer to the poles. These things were loaded with dry air. Then the circulations couldn't tighten up. These things were coming off much farther north than usual. So they weren't able to develop. And then added in this, the warmer ocean that I mentioned earlier made the atmosphere too stable. You need instability, cold air over warm air to create thunderstorm activity that eventually starts the cycle of how a hurricane develops. We just didn't get that into August, but the season we sure paid for it later, rather, with the backloaded season. The waves eventually would make it across, a little bit of assistance from the jet stream on some of these, and you just had a rash of hurricanes, and a lot of them strong in the Western Atlantic and Gulf, September and even deep into October.
You know what was interesting, Jeff? Watching, you can't be a tropical weather geek and not pay close attention to the models. But watching the models and how accurate they were, some of the models were incredibly accurate. But to see just what they were forecasting in intensity of these storms, some of these storms hasn't even formed yet. And to watch them form and to come to fruition on the intensity that the models were saying they were going to get to, that was a scary turn of events. I'll tell you what, I'll get you your answer to that on the other side, and we'll also look ahead to what you think this season is shaping up to look like. We'll continue our conversation with Jeff Vorick on the other side. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to the Ricky Matthews Show from the Citizens Bank studio. We're visiting with my friend Jeff Vorick, who's a meteorologist, used to be with XXV, lives in Houston now. And we stayed in touch since he's been on my show before. And we enjoy talking about weather together. But, the thing I mentioned before we went to break is this seed of something that was beginning to develop, and what the models were doing with it in the Gulf of Mexico. A lot of times we used to see that and say, they're just blowing it up. That's not going to happen. It usually doesn't. But boy, this last season, they actually did. And it was scary to watch, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. And I mean, it was just shocking how accurate these global models were just predicting these things. And then once the Hurricane Center tags it with the Invest, the hurricane models, I mean, they were remarkable. Of course, you have the HWRF and the HMON. I believe they're phased out either the end of last season or the end of this season. Don't quote me on it, though. And the new ones are remarkable. I mean, they did an unbelievable job with every single system we had coming into the Gulf Coast. And I mean, it helped people prepare. The loss of life in the coastal areas has greatly improved in the last about 2 decades or so, since Katrina and Ike claimed so many lives, and starting to get better with the coastal areas. But now we have to start paying attention to the rainfall and the inland wind impacts, because Beryl continued through the Houston area, and where your wife's family from, in the Woodlands. That's 80 miles inland. Significant wind event all through Houston. And Helene, let's not miss out on eastern Georgia, the Savannah River area near Augusta. They got a lot of wind. Midlands of South Carolina got hammered with wind. And then you go into the mountains where it was just horrific. I mean, modeling was great, but you have to have local action and resources and knowledge to be able to get the conversation started, get these people to safer spots. But you have to allocate the resources at the local and state level first. And unfortunately, just it takes a team and it takes an effort by everybody.
Yeah, you know, and essentially what Jeff is saying, think about what happens in coastal Mississippi when a storm is coming. We know where we live in relation to potential storm surge, wind, et cetera. Evacuations are called based on those set of criteria. The emergency officials are big time engaged in that. We can't even imagine how many lives are saved because we have that kind of tight communication around specific storms. It's really important. But they did not have that. They did not have that along some of these rivers and the Appalachian Mountains. They could do warnings through the National Weather Service like they normally do, and it was on a scale of, well, I think 1 to 4. I'm trying to remember the scale on rainfall. It was a 4, and they said it was going to be bad, but they couldn't directly connect every single person to what they might experience, like we might get when we're dealing with a hurricane. I would think that there's been a lot of conversation about that as a result of those learnings.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just one of these rare once in a lifetime events you still have to start preparing for, especially since we're in a bit of a time now where all these hurricanes are hitting land and they are tracking inland very quickly. And you have jet stream influence bringing you winds, tornadoes, and heavy rainfall on top of that. It has to start at the state and local level. And I mean, unfortunately for the poor folks in Western North Carolina, I mean, very rural areas outside of Asheville and Boone, and you have to start. Some of these counties and local areas need to learn their lessons and get everything together, and not at the expense of their people. There just needs to be a team effort at the state and local levels to get this done, because unfortunately, response just wasn't there. But you had a lot of good folks volunteering their time, their aviation equipment, making sure everybody was okay, and it could have been a lot worse in terms of people passing on after the storm, but you got a band of people together to help out, and that's all that matters. But Florida,
we definitely got work to do there. Hey, listen, one thing that when we're thinking about tropical systems, we think a lot about history. When the same kind of set of circumstances come together for the storm that we're looking at now, what other storms in the past have acted or had similar characteristics? And we call that climatology. What's interesting about what AI is doing in these models is it's rolling in climatology and model guidance. And the AI models are going to get, I'm not sure we know yet. I mean, I think we're just beginning to see how AI impacts these models. But I bet the AI models as we go forward are going to get really good.
They are getting better, and it's a great tool to use. You still need the people to be able to disseminate the information, communicate it, address maybe how one model behaves, but it's certainly great to see these tools getting a lot better. And I mean, we're putting out more accurate forecasts than better before. Hurricane Center's done a remarkable job with some of these cones. I mean, Western Florida actually has not been a hurricane hotbed until recently, and I mean, they nailed Helene down to about 15 miles from the first cone, and Milton, they had that thing coming in south of Tampa Bay the entire time as well. So,
hey, we only have like a minute left. So real quick, do you think we're going to have a busy season coming up?
Definitely think everything's there for it. La Nina is in effect right now, warm ocean temperatures. Ultimately, though, all that matters is one system has to track over the correct spot to hit you in your home, and you just have to be prepared every single year, no matter how busy anyone projects it to be.
Jeff, it was great to catch up with you, man. Glad to hear you're doing well. We'll have you back soon. I enjoyed catching up with you.
Likewise. Thank you, Ricky.
It's been great. This has been meteorologist Jeff Vorick. Listen, have a great day, and we will see you tomorrow.